It was quiet, too quiet. That had been what everyone remembered about that day. Ask any member of personnel who was working what the one thing they recalled before it happened. They'd all tell you the same, that it had been too quiet. An eerie lull in the Foundation's usual day-to-day activity, followed by untold, unspeakable chaos. But the quiet had come first, and within that quiet, a madman was hiding. His name was Vince Barrett. At least, that was his legal name, but he much preferred to go by his online moniker of the Tainted Lizard, or just the Zard for short. Anyone who chooses to call themselves something like that in an attempt to sound cool might well be a person to avoid. And in the Zard's case, that sentiment was accurate. He was a social recluse, devoting a lot of his time to some of the darker corners of the internet. And we don't just mean that he spent his days trawling through Reddit. No, the Zard's interests were in the paranormal, the unusual and inexplicable, as well as the community of his fellow internet recluses dedicated to unearthing the true supernatural horrors of the world. Eventually spending so much time in corners of the online world where few normal people would dare to tread, that would lead to Zard becoming a member of the prolific forum known as Parawatch. This was the real deal, not just urban legends and blurry photos of Bigfoot or faked handheld videos of people falling into the backrooms. Parawatch had long been known to and kept under the surveillance of the SCP Foundation. Why? Well, because this infamous online message board would occasionally feature posts about anomalies, some even including SCPs and leaked information about the Foundation themselves. Of course, hardly any of these posts stayed up for very long before the Foundation's tech team scrubbed them permanently. But it was here on the Parawatch forum where Vince Barrett would encounter a fateful video clip. Acting fast, he managed to save the file before it was taken down. It was footage taken from the body cam of a Foundation security officer during the midst of a containment breach. The Zard hit play, his hands shaking with excitement. The original poster of the clip to Parawatch had said that this footage was perhaps the only known video on the entire internet that depicted something known as SCP-682, the hard-to-destroy reptile. Of course, those familiar with 682 and the SCP Foundation will need no introduction, but Vince, on the other hand, had only ever heard rumors about this creature, and now in the video playing on his computer screen, he was seeing it for the first time. The reptile was free from its containment chamber, tearing its way through a Foundation facility and making quick work of dispatching the security personnel that dared to stand in its way. It was a force of unbridled carnage and rage, destroying anything in its path and adapting to its environment. Deep in the Parawatch forum, the Zard had read rumors and leaks from alleged ex-Foundation staff and detractors that 682 was like something out of a nightmare. They said that the creature could adapt perfectly in response to damage inflicted upon it, or to changes in its environment, as well as heal any injury it sustained. It persisted, it kept on going, and something about that enamored Vince to the infamous anomaly. He thought it was beautiful, the ultimate apex predator, and admired the hard-to-destroy reptile's tenacity, as well as its ferocity. Watching the horrific containment breach footage, he realized then and there that he was a devoted fanatic of SCP-682. His time on the dark side of the web had twisted his mind and led him to make one fateful decision, that he needed to see the creature in person. That had been almost a year earlier, and in the time since, the Tainted Lizard had pulled on every dark web string he knew of, eventually getting in contact with a shady group called the Chaos Insurgency. Vince had managed to get a hold of a real-life SCP Foundation keycard, as well as the location of the facility they were holding 682 in, and a forged transfer document. Posing as a humble, unassuming janitor, the Zard had made his way inside the Foundation, and wasted no time in making a beeline straight for the acid tank where 682 was held. He stared at the creature through the glass, eyes wide and jaws slacked in utter awe of the monstrous reptile. Perhaps the biggest fan of SCP-682 on the planet couldn't quite believe he was standing in the presence of the creature itself. It barely seemed to pay him any mind from the other side of the tank, the acid surrounding it melting 682 as fast as it could heal. Seeing it in containment enraged Vince. He hated that the Foundation had kept what he viewed as a perfect organism locked up, after having tried time and time again to destroy it.
"Don't worry,"
the Zard murmured, approaching the tank well over the minimum safe distance.
"You're a force of unparalleled destruction, and you don't deserve to be here. I'm gonna set you free."
Unfortunately, after the glass had been smashed and the alarm screamed out that another containment breach was occurring, Vince would quickly find out that the reptilian beast he revered so highly didn't quite hold him in the same regard. If you thought the Zard was going to make it all the way through this story alive, well, then we regret to inform you that you're sorely mistaken. Although not as woefully misguided as Vince himself, who was the first person in the path of SCP-682 when he freed the creature. What all those leaks and rumors on Pairwatch had failed to mention about the heart to destroy reptile was its vehement and relentless hatred for all other forms of life, including its very own fan. And the Tainted Lizard was only the first casualty of SCP-682's latest rampage. But this time was different. Sure, 682 was easily tearing its way through SCP Foundation personnel left and right. Security teams were flung aside and ripped to shreds as they tried in vain to recontain the monster. Research staff found themselves tripping over each other, trying to rush out of the destructive path of the hard-to-destroy reptile, only to find themselves the next to face its ferocious attack. In other words, it seemed to mostly be another unbridled slaughter, common fare for an SCP-682 containment breach, except rather than breaking its way out of the facility, this particular instance saw the creature heading in the direction of another anomaly, SCP-914, better known as the Clockworks. Now, if a rampaging regenerative reptile on the loose wasn't enough cause for concern, then seeing it moving along its trajectory to another anomalous refinement machine certainly was. Those that had been on the other side of the facility when the dearly departed Zard set 682 free were now looking on in horror as the hard-to-destroy reptile burst into the room housing SCP-914. The Foundation staff, in the midst of panic, stared at security monitors with bated breath, palpable fear hanging in the air. Each and every one of them knew that SCP-682 was more than just a mindless beast. The creature was fiercely, frighteningly intelligent, sentient even. And as it approached the controls for the Clockworks, every onlooker secretly hoped something or someone would step in at the last second and prevent SCP-682 from entering the machine. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. SCP-914 whirred into life, its gears and gyros spinning as SCP-682 entered the input booth. Now, normally the way the Clockworks operates is by destroying any item placed within it and replacing it with something else in the output booth. Depending on its setting, it either completely disintegrates an item, breaks down an object into its base components, replaces it with an equivalent, or improves it. And being set to very fine as it was right now, SCP-914 can even add anomalous properties to whatever is put inside of it. But what happens when an indestructible and infinitely adaptable monstrosity is in the Clockworks? Well, it can't destroy and recreate a better version of something that would be known for being hard to destroy, can it? The entire machine was going haywire. SCP-682 was adapting to the refinement process, refusing to let SCP-914 unmake it, even to replace it with an improved version of itself. The hard-to-destroy reptile and the Clockworks were at a momentary stalemate and watched with bated breath by the Foundation. SCP-914 began to malfunction, its clockwork components getting stuck as if the machine was jammed. Its cogs were clogged up, unable to destroy the subject in the input booth. The room around was beginning to shake. In fact, the very ground was trembling at the force of the whole machine shuddering. "Enact the Abandon All Hope Protocol," the head of research said desperately, watching the events unfold from the other side of the building. The site director looked at them and nodded, the pair of them entering their secure passcodes to activate this secretive security measure. Just as they did, a small earthquake erupted underfoot. The entire wing of the facility housing the Clockworks and SCP-682 had collapsed into the ground. A huge crater was all that remained, littered with wreckage of a whole portion of the Foundation site, along with broken pieces of SCP-914. For the next few minutes, everyone was on edge, secretly hoping that SCP-682 hadn't survived. Maybe the Clockworks had managed to destroy it, but the sheer force of doing so had caused the machine to collapse in on itself. Or perhaps the hard-to-destroy reptile was now buried beneath several thousand tons of debris, dead at long last. But the Foundation staff knew better than to get their hopes up. And sure enough, just as an armed security team approached the crater, something started stirring in the rubble. Suddenly, SCP-682 came bursting out of the crater, emerging in not quite the same state, although no less deadly than before. The Clockworks hadn't been able to unmake the hard-to-destroy reptile, but the resultant malfunction and explosion had imbued the creature with a whole host of new anomalous abilities. It still resembled its old self, but was now more humanoid, standing bipedal instead of on all fours. Some of its body mass had seemingly been reduced due to damage sustained in the malfunction, although SCP-682 was still plenty of feet taller than an ordinary human being. In fact, it could be any height it needed to be. The creature's scaly skin seemed to be shifting unnaturally, moving of its own accord, like it was already preparing to adapt to oncoming damage. And as the nearby security team were about to find out, this made it even deadlier than before. In a panic, the Foundation officers opened fire, only to find that their weapons weren't operating the way they should. Something caused excitation of the copper shells of their bullets, making them either expand and block the barrels of their guns, or causing them to backfire horribly, injuring the security personnel wielding them. Before anybody could even call in air support or heavy artillery as a backup, a number of the Foundation's most powerful weapons suffered even more catastrophic misfires. Missiles detonated early. They hadn't even been aimed at SCP-682 yet, but they would have been. Instead, they exploded, taking with them a huge number of Foundation entities, some miles away from where the newly refined reptile now stood. SCP-682's regenerative powers had been altered by the Clockworks. It wasn't purely reactive to oncoming damage now, it was preemptive. It could adapt to attacks that hadn't even happened yet. With no way of stopping it, SCP-682 began decimating everything in its path with greater ferocity than ever. Over the coming days, the newly dubbed impossible-to-destroy reptile began its biggest rampage yet, entering a permanent rage state and unleashing destruction on a global scale. It stormed through cities and wiped out entire major population centers in moments. It seemed nothing on Earth could stand against the refined reptile, fueled by its singular mission to wipe out all life in existence. The surviving personnel of the SCP Foundation soon came to learn that no damage could be inflicted on the creature whatsoever. SCP-682 could predict attacks ahead of the person that would carry it out, and then adapt, changing the very world around it so that attack never came. The impossible-to-destroy reptile's adaptations usually took the form of diverting any oncoming damage it preempted it would take, and instead inflicted that same damage on whoever it chose. Even though the machine had malfunctioned, the Clockworks had made SCP-682 that good at adapting to its surroundings that the creature had almost become a universal constant. The fact that it could not be harmed now seemed to be as fundamental of a law as that of gravity. But that wasn't going to stop the SCP Foundation from trying. The number of casualties the world over had been increasing steadily day by day as SCP-682 continued its devastating campaign of slaughter. Some of the remaining scraps of the Foundation had tried to subdue the creature, but any attempts at fighting it with conventional weapons were ill-advised, to say the least. After all, how do you fight against a creature that can predict your every move and counter them before you've even thought of those moves? Well, you can try throwing something so unexpected at it. At least pulling something out of left field means that the chances of SCP-682 seeing it coming are slightly slimmer, and that was where the Abandon All Hope Protocol came in. You see, the Foundation had been anticipating that 682 would one day become too powerful to contain long before the creature had gained its new ability to preemptively adapt. And while the worldwide death toll had climbed from hundreds of thousands of innocent people to the earliest millions, an unlikely counterattack was brewing. One so unexpected that even the impossible-to-destroy reptile would struggle to see it coming. Just as humanity was facing the brink of extinction, the Foundation dispatched their last hope at stopping SCP-682, other SCPs. The Abandon All Hope Protocol had been devised for when the suffering and destruction caused by SCP-682 became so great that there were no other options left. When it had been activated, Foundation agents stationed at various sites across the world had gathered a specially selected group of anomalies. Each one was chosen because they were known to be sympathetic towards humanity, or at least be coerced into taking on SCP-682. And now, these SCPs were stepping up to the plate, ready to fight the impossible to destroy reptile, or, more likely, to die trying. SCP-076-2, the immortal warrior known as Abel, was infamous for picking fights. The ancient Sumerian swordsman had a penchant for seeking out the most challenging adversaries, so convincing him to take a crack at SCP-682 wasn't all that difficult. However, rushing into battle against the refined reptile, Abel quickly found he couldn't draw his weapons from his pocket dimension. They were dissipating the moment his fingers touched them, vanishing faster than he could draw. No matter, the warrior thought. He'd been alive for centuries and thus had become a master in every form of hand-to-hand combat. As you can imagine, he didn't last very long, left to slowly revive inside his stone tomb after SCP-682 had finished dispatching him. Abel's brother Cain incurred a slightly different result when he went toe-to-toe with the impossible to destroy reptile. SCP-073 was hardly the fighter his brother was, but had the anomalous trait of reflecting incoming damage back at whoever was inflicting it on him. So when SCP-682 attacked Cain, theoretically the same attack would have bounced back and harmed the reptile itself. And before, that's what would have happened. But now SCP-682 could adapt preemptively. A strange, never-before-seen phenomenon occurred. It appeared that neither SCP-073 nor the refined reptile were harming each other at all. However, on a metaphysical level, the potential damage of 682's attacks against Cain were being reflected back towards the reptile, only for the creature to preemptively adapt to the damage from its own attack being inflicted back. What resulted was a feedback loop of perpetual possible damage that ended only when Cain eventually passed out from shock. Unfortunately, while he could reflect damage back at an attacker, he felt the pain of every hit, and SCP-682 had more than just a mean right hook. The Foundation had hoped, given its 100% mortality record, that SCP-096 would have no trouble killing the impossible to destroy reptile, or at the very least harming it enough so that it could be subdued. After all, 682 still needed to see, and anyone looking at the shy guy quickly met their end. But when the tall, pale humanoid approached SCP-682, something unusual happened. The reptile could look at SCP-096, able to see it perfectly. Perhaps the creature's adaptive properties were creating an intentional blind spot in its vision, removing SCP-096 from view. Or maybe 682 no longer saw with just eyes, perceiving the world in a manner far beyond our understanding of basic sight. But whatever the case, the impossible to destroy reptile made SCP-096 turn and flee in terror. Compelled to put an end to the reptile's reign of terror, SCP-4494, the Spectre, manifested nearby and tried to intervene. The result was nothing short of brutal. A one-sided fight that not even the living embodiment of crime fighting could hope to win. After SCP-682 had finished off the Spectre, a strange black fluid began oozing from nearby. Although one of the hardest to wrangle, the Foundation believed that they had convinced SCP-106 to aid in taking down SCP-682. The old man emerged from the oily secretion, shuffling menacingly towards the impossible to destroy reptile. It seemed to freeze, as if it was taking a defensive stance against the old man. Either that, or tricking him into getting closer. Before he could even reach out a decrepit hand to touch the reptile's shifting skin, SCP-106 was suddenly coated in copious amounts of the black substance he secreted. It coated him like thick tar. The more his decaying body produced, the more he was covered in it. Normally, he was resistant to the corrosive burning effects of this substance. However, SCP-682's preemptive adaptation powers had caused SCP-106 to overproduce the oily substance, enough to rapidly dissolve the old man into a steaming black puddle. It was at this point that SCP-343, colloquially known as God, lowered his newspaper and looked out of his window. That is to say, he looked out of the huge hole that had been left in the wall of his cell. Being omniscient, SCP-343 was already burdened with the awareness of what had happened. SCP-682 had been refined into an even worse version of itself by the Clockworks. Up until now, God had been happy to avoid all the fighting and just see how everything worked out. But as much as he tried to distract himself, SCP-682 slaughtering other SCPs in droves was getting in the way of his reading.
Oh, this again.
In a split second, the entire universe had been unmade and then remade almost exactly the same. Except SCP-343 had made a slight adjustment, giving a little nudge to cause and effect in a few places. As a result, a certain misguided forum user had never and would never infiltrate the Foundation and break SCP-682 free, leading to the hard-to-destroy reptile being refined by the Clockworks. Although, while it had been unceremoniously returned to its original form and placed back in its acid tank, SCP-682 could still remember the power it had wielded only moments before everything had been rewritten. All it needed was another chance to get into the Clockworks. Now go check out SCP-682 Craziest Mutations and Adaptations. And what if the flesh that hates was put inside SCP-914 for more mutational craziness?